The topic for discussion in macroeconomics, the concept of effective demand with the Keynesian cross diagram. Let us go directly to the analysis of a diagram. The vertical axis measures aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and thereby it measures aggregate demand price and aggregate supply price. This is the point of origin O, and the horizontal axis measures the volume of employment, that is the number of people employed. Now we shall draw the aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand curve goes in the upward direction, and it is assumed here a straight line. So aggregate demand, which is a function of employment, represents the expected returns at different levels of employment, and it is assumed here that with the change in the volume of employment, aggregate demand increases, that is the expected returns increases at a constant rate, and thereby the aggregate demand curve here becomes a straight line. Let us look at 3 points on the aggregate demand curve: A, E, and C. These 3 points indicate the expected returns from the level of employment. The first point, A, represents the expected returns A and 1 at point E, E and 2, and at C, C and 3. We see here that as the volume of employment increases, the expected returns also increases, but here it is assumed that expected returns increases at a constant rate, and as such the slope remains constant, and the aggregate demand curve becomes a straight line. Now the aggregate supply curve is drawn. Aggregate supply curve goes in the upward direction. Aggregate supply represents the minimum level of cost or minimum requirements to sustain this level of employment. So as employment increases, the minimum cost for maintaining that level of employment also increases, and it increases at a constant rate. Here we see at the point E, aggregate supply curve intersects the aggregate demand curve. Among these 3 points, A, E, and C, at the point E, aggregate supply becomes equal with aggregate demand, and the level of employment is determined O and 2. So E is the point of effective demand. If the volume of employment is less than the determined level of employment, or the volume of employment is greater than the volume of determined level of employment, then what would be the situation we may consider now? At the level O and 1, aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply, and so the expected receipts is greater than the minimum cost necessary for this level of employment. So here lies the expectation of profit, and this positive profiteering zone will induce the employers to increase the level of employment to O and 2. And if the level of employment is O and 3, then the aggregate supply is greater than aggregate demand. At this situation, the minimum cost necessary for this level of employment is greater than the expected receipts from the level of employment, and so the employment level will decrease at this situation with the anticipated loss. Therefore, the volume of employment here at O and 2, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal, and so the minimum cost necessary for this level of employment and the expected returns are equal, and as such this point is called effective, which will determine this level of employment. Now let us suppose that ON3 is the full employment level. In a capitalistic economy, the entrepreneurs will not proceed up to ON3 because at ON3, aggregate demand falls short of aggregate supply. That is, the expected returns from this level of employment is less than that of the minimum cost necessary to sustain this level of employment. So, the entrepreneurs will stop their employment level at ON2. There will be some people remaining unemployed, and that unemployed people are N2, N3. The deficiency in aggregate demand will be due to the operation of law of diminishing returns and the secular decline in MEC, that is the marginal efficiency of capital, or we may call the deficiency or decline in the expected rate of return from the investment. Now the question arises, what to do to reach the full employment situation? In a private enterprise economy, the underemployment is a natural phenomenon according to Keynes. But to reach the full employment level, then the government is to come forward with its expenditure program or the deficit finance, or maybe the liberalizing the fiscal strategy. Then the aggregate demand curve will be shifted. Aggregate demand curve is shifted upward from AD1 to AD2, and this AD2 intersects the aggregate supply curve at the point D, where the employment level ON3 or ONF is determined. So the full employment level may be attained with active government participation. The employment level which was determined earlier, that was ON2, as ON2 is less than the full employment level, so ON2 is called underemployment. And that's why the effective demand E represents the underemployment equilibrium. Now at D, the full employment level is determined, so the point of effective demand attained at D is to be called the effective demand at full employment. We have so far discussed that employment is determined by the point of effective demand. The underemployment equilibrium is attained in a free enterprise economy normally, but with the government's active participation, full employment level may also be attained. Now we shall see that the income and output of a country depend upon the employment level, and so employment and output or income, all these are interrelated. And we shall show now that how income or output of a country may be determined by the process of effective demand. Here in the diagram, the horizontal axis measures employment and the vertical axis measures output or income. Output or income is a function of employment, and so at a certain level of employment, we can find out the level of income or output easily. At the level employment, the output or income level is OY1. At the level N2 employment, then the income level is OY2, and at level of employment ON3, we get the income level OY3. In this way, we can show that the output or income depends upon the level of employment. Now we shall transform this diagram into the Keynesian cross diagram of income determination. Here we draw the horizontal axis, which measures income or output level, and the vertical axis measures the spending, that is the expenditure level. The 45-degree line we draw, which shows the equality of income and spending at each point. Aggregate demand curve is transformed into aggregate spending or aggregate expenditure, which equals consumption expenditure and investment expenditure. So AD1 equals C plus I, and this AD1 intersects the 45-degree line at the point E, by which the income level OY2 is determined. Now, this OY2 determined level of income at the point E will be called underemployment equilibrium income, as it is related to the underemployment situation of ON2. If government expenditure or government's economic participation is undertaken, then the aggregate demand curve, that is the aggregate spending curve, will be shifted upwards, and it will be AD2. And AD2, which is equal to C plus I plus G, that aggregate spending curve intersects the 45-degree line at the point D, and the full employment income OYF is determined. That OYF is consistent with the employment level ONF. And in this way, if we transform this diagram into the Keynesian cross diagram of income determination, we can explain the income determination by the process of effective demand. With the Keynesian cross diagram of income determination, then we can explain the underemployment equilibrium income and the full employment equilibrium income.